Hello, everyone. Great to be here and to be talking to you about migration. This is the start of our course, and so I'm going to try to give you an overview of what global migration looks today. And it's a huge topic. So I want to just run through a few ideas with you, just to give you some broad strokes about what global migration looks like. And I've split it into two modules. The first is to look at who international migrants are, how many there are, where they're going, where they're coming from, and then talk a little bit about some characteristics of global migration and some ways to think about it that maybe are a little bit different than you've thought about. And then in the second module, I want to talk about some of the consequences of migration, what happens as a result of people moving, how the international community has responded to it, and how national governments have responded to it, and then also what migrants themselves do when they try to strategize responses. So let's start looking at the big picture of international migration. And when we think about global migration, we tend to split it into two types. The first and the biggest type is what we might call regular migration, that is, people who are leaving their countries of birth and traveling to another country. The definition of an international migrant, according to the UN, is someone who has spent more than a year in a country not of their birth. So as we see from this slide, in 2015, the number of international migrants was 244 million, compared to 2000, the year 2000, when that number was 173 million. So in the last 15 years, there's been a 41% increase in the number of international migrants. But it's worth remembering that 244 million is a small fraction of the 7 billion people in the world today. So in fact, it's a very small number of migrants, of people who are actually moving around the world compared to how many who are not moving. Now, when we talk about migrants, we split it into those people who are moving somewhat for their own reasons, maybe to search for work or education, or maybe to join their families in some way. People who kind of choose or are able to plan their migration. And then we talk about forced migration, by which we mean people who are literally forced to leave. They are refugees. They might be other kinds of people. They might be people who are forced to leave because of drought or natural disasters and have had to move across borders. But they might, and refugees, as you know, are people who've been forced to leave because they've been persecuted in their own home countries for reasons of race or religion or ethnicity. And then there are people who have been displaced because of war or violent conflict. And as a matter of fact, a refugee is not, according to the international legal definitions, a refugee is not someone who just flees from war. Someone who flees from war is someone who's been displaced by war and conflict. A refugee, according to our laws, our international treaty laws, is someone who's been individually persecuted. So, for example, if you've been displaced because your village was bombed and you ran across the border from Sudan, Darfur into Chad, although you may be referred to as a refugee legally and technically, you are simply someone who's been displaced by war. Whereas if the government of Sudan had persecuted you and tried to put you in prison, detained you, tortured you because of your religion or because of your political beliefs, then if you flee and are successful in applying for asylum elsewhere, then you may be defined as a refugee. Still, we think about refugees generally as people who fled across the border, and of those people, there are 21 or so million in 2015 compared with 11.7 million in 2000. That's only that's an 82% increase from 2000. But you'll see here, according to this chart, that refugees are only about 8% of the total migrants who are moving around the world. So here we see a map on the next slide of some of the areas from which people move migration generally. This is not just refugees, it's all kinds of migration. And we see that it's within Africa, it's from Africa to Europe, it's from Africa to the Middle East, it's from South Asia, that's India, to the Middle East, and from Southeast Asia all the way across to North America and so forth. So you could have a look at that map and get a sense of how people are moving around the world. This is a map of Europe which depicts the more famous routes that we've been hearing about this past year, where we're seeing massive flows from the Middle East and from Africa across the Mediterranean to Europe. And so this is a map that is done by Frontex, which is the European Security Agency that monitors border crossings into Europe. And here we see how the flows are working. We see from Africa that they're going from mainly Libya and North Africa across the Mediterranean toward Italy. From the Middle East, we see them going across through Turkey and into Eastern and Southern Europe. And we see also from Afghanistan and Pakistan moving across the whole of this middle region, Eastern Europe, toward into Europe. These are the flows that we hear about a lot, but they're just one part of the broader migration movement in the world today. Okay, so that just gives you a little taste of the movements and patterns and how people are moving around. I just want to make a few points about some shifts in global migration that we're seeing in the 21st century and ways to think about it that make it a little bit different than it was even 20 years ago. So the first thing to note is that one of the things we're seeing is that Europe and the US are increasingly conscious and worried about migration. And so they're trying to find ways to stop it. And we see in the media how Europe makes deals and gives money to Turkey to try and stop migrants from coming from Turkey. But there are other ways in which European countries and the US have bilaterally worked with bordering countries to secure the borders on those bordering countries. So for example, in the US government works closely with Mexico to secure the southern Mexican border, which is like a first step in the way for migrants to get to Europe. The idea is if you can securitize or harden those borders before you reach the country of destination itself, you can slow the movement of migrants. So we see the US forming alliances with Mexico to harden its southern border. We see the European Union working with the North African countries to harden their borders and prevent migrants from coming that way. So for example, Italy long ago, before Gaddafi died, had a long-standing agreement with Gaddafi in Libya to prevent migrants from leaving Libya. And Gaddafi had pretty successfully prevented them from leaving Libya. Now that Libya is in pretty much chaos and there's no powerful tyrant to stop migrants from coming, you see huge movements of migration through Libya and from the Libyan shore across the Mediterranean, and all the disastrous dangers that follow when people climb onto boats, leaky boats, and so forth. The second point I want to make is that migration now is very much about smuggling and the illicit or illegal migration industry. For most people in Europe and Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also in Central America, it's virtually impossible to move anywhere without hiring a smuggler to help you do that. You cannot any longer get on a bus or a plane and find your way across these borders into Europe and the US. The only way you're going to do it is to hire a smuggler. So what we've seen is the rise of this illicit migration industry, and now one of the most powerful and well-financed industries in the world. And of course, as we know, if something becomes very profitable, it's going to become very powerful too. And so it's very difficult for us to think about addressing migration without taking into account the enormous importance and power of the illicit migration industry. A third thing to think about is that is migration politics, both in the EU and the US, but also in other countries, other destination countries in within Africa and Asia and South America. And here I'm talking about what we call xenophobia, which is basically xenophobia means a fear of strangers. And we're seeing that this a rise of xenophobia in Europe, also in African countries like South Africa, where the people themselves are have become very anti-immigrant, and this feeling is fueled by politicians who see their political futures tied up with supporting anti-immigrant fears and blaming migrants for the problems of their countries and yeah, feeding off this anti-migrant fear and insecurity in order to yeah, support their own political ambitions. So this is something that also makes it very difficult to shape policy when you have this populist anti-migrant um, attitudes in these destination countries. A fourth feature about global migration is the increased presence of women and youth. It used to be that migrants pretty much were young men moving about, or men in general trying to find work and moving. And that is still dominantly that it is mostly young and men in general that are moving. But increasingly in the last few years, we're seeing more women who are trying to move too. And in a a big concern of this is that we're seeing more children as part of these migrant flows. Often it's families who trying to help their children or give them a better life and just put them on the road, or sometimes it's children themselves who don't have families, who have lost them because of conflict and just feel that the only thing to do is to join these flows. And these children are in great danger on these journeys because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, those journeys are extremely dangerous. And finally, just one last piece of what's different in the 21st century is that increasingly migration is toward urban centers. People don't move around and go to farming areas or rural areas. They go to cities. And both internal migration, that is people move from rural farming or pastoralist areas into cities, and it's external or international migration. People leave their countries and go to other cities. And this is the case whether it's for labor migration, economic migration, and it's also the case for forced migration. So refugees are going into cities now. They may spend some time in camps, in refugee camps, but they often try to leave those camps and move on to cities. So I'm going to stop there because let's take a break now, and then we'll think of some new other ways to think about global migration.